Hey guys, I'm back with a new video, something a little bit different today. I have this box that we've used in a previous video to kind of show off these ozone woofers and what they're about. This enclosure is tuned for these woofers for more of an SQ style sound. So what I want to do today is actually bust a myth. I want to check out if inverting your subwoofers actually makes a difference, and if so, what does it make? The best way we're actually going to be able to test this is with the AMM1, and we're going to test tuning frequency. So on this board behind us, we actually have written on here the normal frequency and the inverted frequency. So we're going to see if this actually lowers or raises the tuning of the enclosure, and by how much. So we're going to actually see if it makes any difference at all. If so, what the difference is. And for an added bonus, this is an SQ style enclosure, so it's going to give not quite as much extension, but it's going to give a nice hump through the normal range that most people listen to, but not as much of a peak. And what I'm going to actually do is we'll put these subwoofers in an SPL specific enclosure that some guys are going to run. We're going to see if the results differ between an SQ and an SPL type enclosure. So we're going to run both of these woofers, standard and inverted, in an SQ purpose-built and an SPL purpose-built enclosure. And we're going to see what the actual differences are versus inverted and conventional. It's important to note that these have a round style port and the other one has a square style port. That's just what we have to deal with. But the tuning frequency should be the target we're actually looking for. And if the tuning frequency changes, that means that the volume is going to change, and that means our graph and our extension will also change. So I have my AMM1 connected so we can test the tuning frequency. This is going to be a very loud video, so we're going to be playing the woofers. I may edit that and turn that down. I don't know how that's going to turn out, but the woofers are going to have to play for me to determine the tuning frequency. Now I'm going to actually test for the tuning of this enclosure. So if you watch the AMM1 right here, as I increase the frequency, I'm going to play the subwoofers. It might be a little loud. So you can see the frequency that is playing. It's very important that the woofers are playing for this to work. So what we're going to do is increase the frequency. We're going to start out about 28, 30. And what you're doing is you're watching the ohms. So we're going to watch these ohms and we're going to go up in frequency. And you will notice that the ohms will drop. And they will increase. So you notice there they're increasing. And now we're going to decrease. We want to get it as low as possible. So see, we're at 1.3. Okay, so now we went to 1.4. So we're going to try to find that happy medium. Okay, so we're between 37 and 30. So now you can go to the second test, which is actually watching the speaker cone right here move. So I'm going to turn the power up a little bit more. And you can watch it move. And what you want to do is looking for the least amount of movement, which in our case is right there. So 36 hertz. 36 hertz will be our very first number. All right, so I'm going to break out my whiteboard and write 36 hertz. Right there. 36 hertz for normal on the SQ enclosure. All right. Now what we're going to do is actually invert these, and we're going to see inside the box while we're there, but we're going to invert these and we're going to do the same test again. you haven't seen these already, these are really nice woofers. This box was made specifically for these to be more of a musical enclosure rather than a SPL enclosure. That's fine because we have SPL enclosures. These are big, meaty subs. Like I said, they're not the biggest in the world, but they are very respectable as far as power goes. All right, so we're going to connect these up in parallel and run it again. All right, so try not to mind my messy wiring right there. It's just temporary. It's purely scientific at this point. All we want to do is see what the tuning is of these woofers. So now they're inverted, the same enclosure. Now we're going to test the tuning frequency of this enclosure to see if it changes at all. We'll put this in the impedance mode right here for testing your tuning frequency. And now we will begin to find our tuning. Okay, so immediately it's lower. Okay, so that's 31. Okay, that's 35. So it's narrowed our tuning band. Okay, so the first thing it did is actually narrowed our tuning band and gave us a peak at whatever that frequency was. So that tells me that it probably made the enclosure larger. Obviously, it makes sense being that all the mass is on the outside. But let's see what that tuning actually is. Okay, so it seems like this one is around 33.5 hertz now that we've flipped this. So we're going to write that down. And I'm also going to note on here a narrower band. So I guess now what we're going to do is pull these woofers out and get out the SPL oriented enclosure and throw this up on here. I'll show you what that's about, and then we'll get these wired up in that enclosure. So this enclosure was actually built on the CT Sounds website design. So being that it's a very large enclosure, very big port, internal bracing of sorts, this is supposed to be a very loud enclosure. So let's throw our subwoofers in here and do our first test, and then we'll invert them and we'll test it again. The wires are on the back, so we're just gonna have to see how we can see that with the AMM1. Maybe I'll just dangle it down like that. Okay, that might work. Let's go ahead and get in a little closer on it. All right, probably like that. Change your mode. All right, let's turn it on and run the test again. In this case, it's SPL, so we're going to start much lower, about 24 hertz. Hopefully it doesn't shake that off of there because it's liable to. The woofers are moving and it can't even be seen. It's very faint. Okay, we're going to increase frequency and find the tuning. It's already much louder. We're at 1 ohm. Okay, so we're at 1.1, so it's definitely below that. This is definitely an SPL oriented enclosure. There we go. It's a very narrow band right there. So it appears we're actually right at about 30 hertz. Somewhere between 29 and 30 hertz. So if I do my visual test, yep, it's definitely yep. So actually with these woofers and this enclosure, that's actually like 29.5 hertz. So I'll go ahead and write that down. All right, and if you notice that band, the frequency bandwidth right there was extremely narrow. It was very, very, very tight. So if you were going, you know, the valley is very, very steep and very narrow on the bottom. That means your SPL is going to be very loud and peaky at that frequency, and it will extend pretty low, but you're going to have a big die-off before that. So this is definitely an SPL enclosure. You can already tell it's so much louder on a lot less power. You notice that the ohms were actually a little bit lower because it was stabilizing at that frequency a little more. That's what your big port helps you do. So if you want to be loud, big box, big port, that's where it's at. Let's invert these and see what happens. Alrighty, and like I said, don't mind the mess because this is strictly experimental. We're going to turn these on. We have these inverted in the SPL enclosure, and there's the MM1. We're going to be watching that little guy. Let's turn it up a little bit and find our tuning. Notice it's right away, it's 1 ohm. I suspect from this test, based on the last test, that we'll see a lower frequency. So I'm going to start even lower, somewhere around 24 hertz, and then come up and see if that is indeed the case. All right, so we have the AM1 right there. Let's test our tuning. Like I said, we're going to start with the lower frequency because we presume that this is going to be lower. So I'm going to start around 24 hertz in this case, and then we'll come up. So because this SPL enclosure, it's going to be closer to 1 ohm, which is nice, very efficient. And I'll get to some of that in a minute, but we're going to start bringing this up to see what the tuning is. Okay, so 28. Oh no, immediately we're going up. Okay, 27. Wow, this is 27 hertz on the nose. Notice how narrow that band is. The bigger enclosure you get, compared to your woofer size, your band is going to get very narrow. So in this case, we literally were 27 hertz, and if we go up or down, it will increase that impedance. Wow, that's crazy. So if we go 26, it goes up, and if we go to 28, it goes up. 27 is our number 100%. 27 is our number. Let me go ahead and write that down, 27. Alrighty. So now we have our 4 points of data. So I want to step back and actually show you some of this stuff and what it actually means. All right, so this is kind of crude, but we're going to go over this, okay? So in the SPL enclosure, which is a little bit smaller, we're looking at 36 hertz, okay? For now, all these tests are for two woofers, the same woofer, the same power, wired the same way. And if actually I need to write down on here, this one was 1.1 and this one was 1.0, okay? So at tuning on this enclosure here, this is inverted, this is SPL inverted, so this is going to be a larger airspace inside the enclosure. We have a very low tuning of about 27 hertz, and we have this magic 1 ohm number. These are wired to 1 ohm. So as you have a bigger enclosure and a bigger port, and you play near this tuning frequency, you will have a higher wattage will be drawn from the amp, but you have a very steep curve for the SPL. So we're talking 1 ohm here, but as soon as you leave this frequency band either direction, you're going to increase in frequency or in ohms exponentially. Right? So that's where that curve is. So if you have an SPL oriented enclosure and you play near your tuning frequency, you will get the most power from your amplifier. But the farther you go away from tuning, you will increase your impedance, which will reduce your power. So that's why SPL is very important to build to your subwoofers and build to your application. You notice that with the normal, we had a bit narrower of a band, right, for the tuning, and we were at 1.1 ohms, which is still pretty good. All this is very respectable, so don't get too twisted with it. But notice between the two different enclosures, from normal to inverted, we have a 10 hertz frequency range here that we've expanded to. So if we go all the way to the other side for the normal SQ tuned enclosure, it's kind of a smaller enclosure in comparison. We were at like 1.3, a little bit over. I think I have these two backwards. But we have a very wide frequency band, something like that. And then as you notice that as you go up in enclosure size, you end up with a wider frequency band. And the important part here is not the frequencies, it is actually the tuning of the enclosure. So this point here that I marked, this is presuming the tuning of the enclosure right here. So as you go away from the tuning, say in this case upwards of 35, and then in this case downwards of 31, you'll lie somewhere on this graph. And what that means is that you will get less power out of the amplifier, because all intents and purposes, as your impedance goes up, your power goes down, right? So you see a lot of guys and they're running, and sometimes they're getting crazy ohms increases, impedance rise from the enclosure, because their box is tuned wrong or they're playing away from tuning. So it's important to test all of your numbers at tuning. It's more important to make your tuning based on your listening application, because this is a very simple way to see how simply changing the enclosure can change every part of the equation. So what you also have to realize too is that this curve, this impedance curve, is also an inverse of your frequency curve, right? If you look on the charts and the software, they kind of go something like this. They go kind of hand in hand. So you'll have your highest peak of your highest frequency at your lowest impedance, and then they tend to die off at a point, and that's where you get that hump in your graph. So in this case, we'll end up with a very high hump at this frequency, but it won't want to play any of the other frequencies very well. In this case, we will end up with a very gradual hump, so it'll play a very wide range of frequencies very nicely, and it won't die off too early or too soon. At the cost, it's going to take a little bit bigger amplifier to do so. This is also where sealed enclosures get a bad rep, because they have a very wide range of frequencies and they take a lot of power to do so, because your efficiency is gained by adding this port at one frequency. In this case, for this size, 36, and then simply inverting the woofers dropped us to around 33.5. And then in this case over here, the normal was around 29. 30 hertz with these woofers, and then goes all the way up to down to 27 when you invert them. So in this case, inverting the woofers may not be a good thing. That may be too low. Most of your music maybe won't play that low. But in this case, 36, that may be too high. Some of your stuff, you know, it's going to die off a little sooner. At the end, you know, if you're looking at 36, you may get down to about 30, 32 hertz. If you want to play lower, you have to tune lower. In this case, this will play well below 30 hertz, down to about 28. At 28 in this enclosure, it was affecting the way my speech was. It was actually kind of breathing for me just a little bit and affecting my speech pattern. So anyways, that's a lot of information, kind of crammed it at you. But basically, a larger enclosure for a similar port size will give you a lower tuning, and a smaller enclosure for a given port size will give you a higher tuning. That's just how the math works. But in this case, in simply inverting the woofers will lower the frequency and narrow the band it plays at that frequency. And you can see that even with the larger enclosure here. For dynamic, this enclosure is probably somewhere around 1 3/4 to 2 hertz, or 2 cubic feet, and this one here is probably about 2.5 to 3 cubic feet. I don't know the exact math off top, but you can see that this enclosure will play lower because it is larger. It does have a larger port. It will be louder, has a much narrower frequency band. It will be louder, and you also have less of an impedance drop at that frequency. So this will play low and loud. This is somewhere kind of in the middle, still pretty low, still pretty loud. And as you get down the line for the SQ, it won't play quite as low, won't play quite as loud, but it will be a little flatter in response. And that's why I wanted to try 2 separate boxes with 2 separate volumes by simply changing the woofer. So to answer the question, yes, inverting the woofer absolutely makes a difference. Yes, that difference can be very dramatic. And yes, you may want to do that if your enclosure and your listening type don't match. You could probably help that. So just knowing that inverting will seem like it's a larger enclosure, will decrease your frequency compared to the same enclosure with them mounted normally. So if you're already playing too low, you're going to have to take some of that space away. I can't help you there. But if you're not playing low enough, by simply flipping them around, you can get much lower. Some of your prefab enclosures are tuned like this from the factory. So by simply inverting, you can get more of this, more SPL and narrow band, a little bit louder and a little bit lower. And if you have an SPL enclosure, you can hit even lower, potentially too low for your woofer to handle. So you need to be careful. Well, that's all for me. Remember, stay clean.